Gentiles. Help me with the whole context here. Why is that such a point of contention? Why did that become the focus of this passage? What's the big deal? Okay, so Paul notes that the Jews thought the Gentiles were sinners, but Paul, we're talking about believers here. Did the Jewish believers think that the Gentile believers were sinners? I don't know about that. So Nancy notes there is this purity idea, this uncleanness idea. Somebody help me with that. Why does that come into play here? Okay. So we got this circumcision and uncircumcision for sure, and how did the Jews respond to that? How do they feel about that? So it goes a little bit back to the issue, perhaps, and Paulette notes, is this issue very similar to verses 1 through 10? That perhaps it was this notion that these Gentiles should have been circumcised, and until they are, we don't know that we can associate with them. That perhaps is very, very likely. So if you didn't hear that, Dad notes that there were dietary restrictions under the Jewish law that obviously the Gentiles had never observed. There's a few important things to think about in that regard. Were the Jewish Christians in Antioch, were they still required to keep those dietary laws? They were not required, okay? Did some of them still observe those dietary laws? Apparently they did. And when we talk about dietary laws, what are we talking about? Just for an example. Pork being one, right? So think about any number of things in the old law. The word that you might think about is kosher, right? That's kind of a word that's a shorthand for the Jewish diet. So, was it a requirement of Jewish Christians? No. Did they still observe those things? It's obvious that they did. So where did the problem come in between let me ask another question. Was there anything sinful about these Jews continuing to observe those dietary laws?
Someone else to do it.
Okay, so Paulette makes a very key point. Wasn't the observance of these laws? We know that Paul continued to observe some Jewish traditions, right? But the holding of those things on somebody else. I've heard Kyle describe it as, I can build fences for my family that I think make sense, that provide certain rules and certain protections. When I start to hold others accountable to those fences that aren't in God's Word, that's when it gets into a problem. So these Jews were observing these laws, and there's not a problem with that until we come into conflict with these Gentile believers. Ms. Carroll.
Verses, it called the group from Jerusalem the circumcised group.
Yes. Yeah, so Ms. Carroll notes in chapter 2, the end of verse 12, and your version may read this a little differently. But first it says these men came from James. We talked about that a little bit last time. That is not particularly flattering to James. Whatever that means, it's not flattering to James. But it says they came from James, but then in the end it calls them the circumcision group or the circumcision party. Not just Jewish Christians, but the circumcision party. And I think maybe that goes a little bit to what Paulette said, is this is the same kind of general idea, the same general group that was holding those works of the old law in the first 10 verses about circumcision now are kind of holding works of the old law about dietary restrictions. And you can see how those things would run parallel, that the same group who would hold to the one would hold to the other. It's the same general idea. And what's that general idea that would make those two things run together? Keeping the law of Moses, right? You're exactly right. So it would make sense, right? That the same general group of Christians who was trying to hold circumcision would also be trying to hold on to these dietary laws. It was the same idea of keeping the law of Moses. And it was, Ms. Carroll notes, and this is an important point, I think, is it was a firmly established tradition certainly of their race, of their families, not just of their religion, right? But it was a tradition of their families. It was a tradition of their culture. It was a tradition of their whole ethnicity was in some of these traditions about foods. And so you got to think about to the Jew, it would have been extremely difficult just to drop all of these things altogether, just to change your entire diet and lifestyle. Like Christianity didn't require that, right? We've already said that. It wasn't the observance of these things that was the problem, but it's really hard to differentiate, right, between the observance of them and the holding them on others. And just as a thought question, we don't get this in our text, but I thought about this a little bit. Do you think that the Gentile believers in Antioch were sensitive to the Jewish dietary restrictions? What do we think? I got a probably not up here. Yes. Yeah, let me be more clear my question, Roger. That's good. So, do we think the Gentile Christians in Antioch were aware, let's say first, were they aware that the Jews had a different diet and a different culture and different traditions? For sure they were aware. Do we think that the Gentile Christians were aware that the Jews had conscience problems with some of the things that the Gentiles ate? Sure they did. Of course, yeah, I think that would be obvious. Do we think that the Jewish, back up. Do we think that the Gentile Christians, if they were rightly being taught and trying to preserve the unity of the gospel and all this kind of stuff, do you think that they were at least attempting to be sensitive to those dietary laws? I would bet they were. If they were taught by Paul, I bet they were. And yet, we still get this issue. I was only going to pick on them if they were here, but they're not here. I'm going to pick on them anyway. There are certain people who have dietary restrictions today. My wife has some dietary restrictions. I try to stay within those guidelines. And yet, the other day, I blatantly offered her something that I know makes her sick. I literally handed it to her on a plate. So excited that I brought it to her. I said, look, babe, here's what I brought you. And it was clearly something that was going to make her ill. It's like, where was I? What was I thinking? We have done this with, there's certain families here, the Gersby one, have some dietary restrictions. We've had them to the house and presented them things that were going to make them ill. That seems so dumb and heartless to say, and we've done it. I've done it. It's difficult when you don't live in those kind of observances and restrictions every day. It's extremely difficult to stay within those guidelines. It's hard for me. It makes perfect sense to me why the Gentiles, even though these Gentile Christians who may have been aware of these Jewish restrictions and even sensitive to them, there's still going to be issues, right? And do we think that early Christians shared meals together? Yes, we know they did, right? We know they did. In places like Corinth, in a way, in a culture, in a way that we don't, in the exact same way, they shared meals together, right? How do we know? Because in Corinth, there was a big division between those who brought a lot to eat and those who didn't have enough to eat, and it created this kind of economic division between the two groups as they kind of brought this potluck together. But here in Antioch, what was the division becoming? What's that?
A matter of fellowship.
Yeah, so literally who you were going to fellowship with. So you can imagine we're having a potluck. Everybody brings their stuff, but now our church is like completely divided, that this is the Jewish side and this is the Gentile side. That, I think, gives us a sense of what was beginning to happen in Antioch. And who was one of the, whether they were aware of it or not, who was one of the instigators of the division? Peter, an apostle.
Michael, in my mind, I see them all sitting down there eating. Then comes the Jewish party, and Peter immediately gets up, and everybody follows him.
So that's a visual, right? That's a visual that there must have been a time where everyone was together. At least Paul seems to indicate that. The verb, the type of verb, the tense that's used in the way I understand it, is this was something that kind of happened over time. That Peter withdrew himself, that over a period of time, I think that's even the word that's used, right? That he drew back, he withdrew himself, and began to separate himself from the Gentile Christians and created this division. It's a simple question, but just so we all are on the same page here. Why was this a problem? Why is it a problem that the Gentile Christians eat over here and the Jewish Christians eat over here? We're all believing in the same Jesus. We're all obeying the same things for salvation. What's the issue with Gentile Christians over here and Jewish Christians over here? Ron?
Spoiling everything. Paul is taught about this. We're not under what used to be. This is all, we're all one now. Like this is all under the same hood, or whatever you want to say. It's the mystery of the gospel.
Yes. So this is kind of thoroughly in contradiction to everything that Paul had worked to achieve, right? In Antioch and in the churches of Galatia, to eliminate this distinction. Again, really hard to achieve, really hard to comprehend, but eliminate any kind of ethnic distinction. Partiality, yeah, that's a really good word. Was Peter showing partiality? Yes.
Would it have affected, if the attitude is not necessarily the dietary restrictions, but Jews viewing Gentiles as unclean and not wanting to eat with them in like a covenant intimacy kind of way, would it have affected the Lord's Supper? Would they have eventually, or were they separating themselves?
So Tara asked, could this division, could this hypocrisy have affected the Lord's Supper? That isn't said explicitly in the text, but I don't think that's unreasonable. We know that Paul says that, at that time, that these meals in some way were involved with or included the Lord's Supper, included communion. At least they were in Corinth. Could it have been the same way in Antioch, and could this division have even included a division in how they were treating the Lord's Supper? That's not unreasonable. It could have got to that extent. To kind of highlight this importance of who you eat with, is this the first time that Peter has been challenged about who he was eating with? No. Acts chapter 11. Come with me to Acts chapter 11. I think that's part of what makes this text so interesting, is Peter has been confronted with this exact same question previously. Acts chapter 11, verses 1 through 3. We know that Peter, in that account in Acts 10, the conversion of Cornelius, and literally in the analogy to show that Cornelius was under the new law, was clean and able to be saved. What was the analogy? What was the vision that Peter saw? What's that? So was Cornelius unclean? I think that's the question. What the actual vision in Acts chapter 10? What was the vision Peter saw? Remember, brought the sheet, vision of the sheet, and what's in the sheet? Peter understood it as foods, clean and unclean foods, and he was said, kill and eat, right? That it was literally about eating. That was the whole vision that Peter was given. He says, I can't eat unclean things, and God says, these things aren't unclean anymore. That was the whole context of the conversion of Cornelius. And then when Peter has to explain himself to the church in Judea, I don't know about this story. We got a Gentile brother now. How does that work? Read with me in verses 1 through 3 of Acts chapter 11. Actually, if somebody read that for me. Darren, you read that?
The apostles and the brothers and sisters who were throughout Judea heard that the Gentiles had also received the word of God. When Peter went up to Jerusalem, the circumcision party criticized him, saying, "You went to uncircumcised men and ate with them."
A couple of things I think are fascinating about that just short passage. One, Miss Carol, we get the circumcision party again. So we've kind of identified this group again. That's at least how Darren's version rendered that in the end of verse 2. The second thing is, this circumcision party, did they say, I can't believe you baptized a Gentile? That's not what they said. They said, I can't believe that you allowed a Gentile to become a Christian. That's not what they said. What was their specific charge? I can't believe you ate with him. Isn't that interesting? That should it gives me some insight into the kind of the depth of the tradition about who you could eat with. That there have been centuries of Pharisaical teaching, right? Adding to the law about, again, building fences, but holding others accountable to those fences about who you eat with. To the extent that when Peter gets this miraculous encounter with Cornelius, the charge is, I can't believe you ate with a Gentile. That's pretty interesting. I am.
Thank you, Miss Carol. I've always wanted to know the answer.
So, it is, I think we shouldn't think about it, Ms. Carol, that differently than political affiliations today. It's not the same. There's not a liberal conservative element to it, but there is an idea of there is this political idea. There's this party that I hold to. That's who I hang out with. That's who the beliefs that I have the same beliefs. We go to argue our case together. You just kind of become associated with this party. And so there is this circumcision party. This is a whole sidebar, but Tara asks constantly, said, how did they know that all these people were circumcised or uncircumcised? I'm going to leave that to your own study. I don't have a clue on that answer, but it seems like it's just common knowledge. The next guy that comes in, we somehow we just know. It's really strange time. Okay. We're going to go down this path?
No.
Okay. Okay.
I've seen kind of the same thing happen today where, like, we can logically, surface level, accept that somebody else is a Christian, but when it comes to socializing with them or even our opinions of them, do we do the same thing based on political affiliation or the way that they choose to raise their children, or a whole host of things that, I mean, it's easy to say, yeah, praise God, they're a Christian, they're one of us, but then when it comes to our interactions with them, are we guilty of doing the same?
So Tara notes that sometimes it's easy to intellectually accept someone as a Christian. It's sometimes more difficult to, in a true fellowship love and brotherhood kind of way, accept them as a Christian. And it seems that some of the Jewish folks had trouble with this. Okay, so Peter has faced this very same issue before. I can't believe you ate with the Gentiles. He explained his case in Acts 11 about why he did that. But now, several years later, he's in Antioch, and I'm going to skip down to the third question on the board. It says that Paul says specifically that he feared, he did this, he made this choice because of fear. That is in verse 12. He withdrew because of fear. Help me understand that. What would Peter have been afraid of? And by the way, it says specifically who he was afraid of in verse 12. Who's he afraid of? The circumcision party. Well, what did he have to fear? What's that? Okay, so was there some physical safety kind of fear? It might be a little far-fetched, but that could possibly be an element. So if it's not that, if we kind of take that off the board, if it's not physical safety, what did he have to fear? And now, as far as in the eyes of the circumcision party, what had he gone against? So he's going against the Mosaic law, and so
Basically,
what's that?
backlash.
Yes.
His status.
Yeah, I think, I don't mind to use the word status, Roger. I think, and ridicule, as Cody notes, I think, at least as best I can understand it, this is what Peter had to fear, was his reputation in Jerusalem. It's clear from Acts 15 that Peter was he was a leader of the church, perhaps an elder of the church in Jerusalem. And as we've already noted, the church in Jerusalem is made up of who? Made up of Jews. And at least part of that group, again, who we're trying to be graceful toward and integrate in and teach, part of that group is the circumcision party. So, again, without just casting them out, we're trying to teach them, we're trying to be graceful, we're trying to bring them along. But that's part of the church in Jerusalem that Peter is a leader of. And Peter must have been afraid of what they would say about him when they got back to Jerusalem. Do you know what Peter's doing up in Antioch? Yes.
So this has a ripple effect.
Yes.
So it has, ultimately, it's going to breed disrespect for God and for God's word.
Yes.
Peter's inspired.
This Peter being inspired, I think, speaks a little bit, Roger, to the second question here, is could Peter have responded in such a way to Paul's confrontation here that his own salvation could have been at risk? Certainly, right? If nothing else, we could point to Judas, right? Can apostles leave the path? Certainly. They're human. That's exactly right. Yeah, so this idea of, obviously the apostles are incredible models for us in many ways. They're also human, right? They're also human. And Peter makes a very human error here. Because of fear of his reputation, because of fear of what other people might say about him, he does something which is not like overtly sinful, but certainly the impacts of it are. Cody. Yeah, literally Peter himself, what does Paul say? He stood condemned. Certainly.
God is using him
Yeah.
that we need
That Martin Luther had this quote I read, obviously not on board with everything that he said, but he did say, if Peter could fall, then I can fall. And I think Cody, that point is really important. That Peter here gets caught up in a very human thing about trying to protect his reputation, or being worried about what other people thought of him, or being worried about what they were going to say about him, and so he falls into this. And to what the extent is pretty interesting. Who else is noted here specifically that gets caught up in this? That is almost more shocking to me than Peter, candidly. So where has Barnabas been? Well, we'll talk about where the timeline of this falls. It's somewhere around Acts 15, either right before or right after probably. But where has Barnabas been for the past 5 years? With Paul. Where? In Galatia and all these other Gentile churches, converting scores of Gentiles, leading them to Jesus, teaching them. And even Barnabas gets pulled away in this division of where we're going to eat. That to me is shocking stuff. Ron. No question.
That to me is where, I think we're talking about this now, we get hammered kind of right here. We're not really giving credit to Peter here and the relationship he has with Paul here, where he took this on the chin from Paul. Well, like how you're saying, the easy response would have been, dude, I walked with Jesus. Who are you? You used to kill. I mean, like, who are you talking to? Like, where you get off? Kind of thing. To me, that's the real temptation he had here. He gave into a little, human side, but the Christian grounded side came out at the end and said, like you said, I stood condemned. I should not have done this. Not only that, I led Barnabas down this path too. Devout as that man is, because to me, it's Peter's status right there.
Yeah, there's two things that Ron said there that I think are really, really perfect. One is, why did all of these men follow Peter? It's because Peter was very well respected, right? I mean, it was Peter on Acts 2. It was the day of Pentecost. It was Peter in the house of Cornelius. This is Peter. So that you got to put that in this context. But the other part, Ron, and this is really the whole point of question 2 in our lesson, is how does this fit into Paul's argument? It's exactly what Ron said, is what Peter did not say, who are you to tell me this? And Peter did not say, look, I'm an apostle, buddy. Who are you? This is Paul's whole argument. I had the authority to say this to Peter because I too am an apostle. and not a lesser one. That I was given the gospel just like they were, by revelation, right? This concludes the whole argument that he's making all the way back to chapter 1 because somebody is questioning Paul's authority in Galatia. And this whole argument, it says, I am not inferior to the other apostles in what I was given. They saw that we had the same gospel. And there are times when I had to rebuke an apostle. My teaching is authoritative and legitimate because of all those things. So that I think all that was baked into what Ron said.
That might have been something to do with food too.
How's that?
The food on one side might look better than the food on the other.
Well, I think we can be sure, Barry, that the food was different.
Drug them over to that side.
Yeah, the food was different, and so he drug them over. He drug them over to that side.
Not the first time Peter dealt with self-preservation before.
Ooh, that's a good point. Dive into that.
Yeah, so I mean, he denied Christ 3 times.
Yes. Why?
For what reason?
And what was it?
I don't want to deal with what he's dealing with.
Self-preservation. So we see this. Look, we've all got our tendencies, right? We see this tendency in Peter towards self-preservation.
I think just thinking about what Ron said, good point. I mean, but Peter knew he was wrong. He would have known he was wrong. This is what he was teaching. I think about verse 23, the idea of doubts is damned if he eats. It's not of faith. It's what not of faith is sin. So you got to kind of do something with good conscience.
Mm-hmm.
So it takes time, a little bit of a process, even knowing we all get caught up in the used to's, kind of creatures of habit, and refer back to basics sometimes, and the basics may or may not be right. So kind of giving Peter a little bit of grace here. It's just a learning curve.
It is.
Especially if you add in pressures and have those calls.
Yes.
It's good to have those calls in our lives. It's good to be those calls sometimes. Really, call folks out.
No question. That goes a little bit to the last question I asked here is what do we learn about how to handle conflict? We don't have time to dive into that fully, but Paul thought that this was an important enough issue that it needed to be confronted, and we note here that it needed to be confronted publicly. There is some biblical precedent for that, right? First Timothy 5 and verse 20, which is kind of one of these Bible verses I'm uncomfortable with. Everybody, but that's my problem. I got to deal with that. That's what the Scripture says. In some way, we can turn to that real quick. We don't have time to dive into all the implications of it. But 1 Timothy 5 and verse 20, as for those who persist in sin, rebuke them in the presence of all so that the rest may stand in fear, is a biblical precedent given, or a command given to Timothy. So we need to consider that. My tendency would be, praise privately, praise publicly, rebuke privately. But there are times that Paul notes to Timothy and then notes here that it needs to be done in a more public way. I'll leave that for your thoughts. We don't have time to dig into all the implications of that. So Ron answered this question: how does this, in the context of what we're studying in Galatians, I just think it's important to kind of put this all in perspective. That remember in chapter 1, this fits in the argument that Paul is making, right? Paul, your teaching is not authoritative. Who are you? You're this apostle of men. Somebody taught you, and now you're teaching a perverted gospel. And Paul says, I didn't get this from men. I didn't get a commission from the apostles. I was independent from them. I didn't even meet with them for 14 years, really, to talk about the guts of the gospel. In the beginning of chapter 2, I think it's interesting in verse 5, he says, I went to Jerusalem in order that the gospel might be preserved. He uses that word specifically. I didn't go to get their approval. I went to preserve the gospel and to confirm that we were on the same page. And all these pillars of the church in Jerusalem agreed that we preach the same gospel, that I was going to go to the Gentiles and they were going to go to the Jews. And then in these verses that we're studying today, that my apostleship is so secure and so firmly established that when Peter was in error, I was able to deal with that. So I hope that kind of helps us in the context of Paul spends a lot of ink here defending his apostleship, and we're still in that mode. I think it's interesting that at the same time he's teaching against Judaizing teachers. All this time he's kind of meshing those two arguments together. You know, the issues of chapter 2 are all about Judaizing teachers, which we're going to talk about a lot more in the next couple of chapters, but that it's all part of his argument about Paul's overall defense. And just in the last couple minutes, this is probably the least interesting question, but one I hope you thought about a little bit, and that is, where does this fit in the timeline? Logically, you kind of read it, it kind of feels like this comes right after Acts chapter 15. But a lot of it depends on when you think Galatians was written, obviously. So, in any event, the context of what's being talked about, right? People coming from Judea or Jerusalem to teach about Judaizing ideas and Paul having to deal with that, the idea, the context of Galatians 2 and Acts 15 and now these verses are very similar. People coming from Jerusalem to spread division between Jew and Gentile, and Paul having to deal with that. There's some argument that maybe this happened before Acts 15, and it was this that helped Peter get his thoughts aligned so that he could go into that meeting with the correct frame of mind and handle those issues correctly. And we'll leave that to your study. On lesson 12, we'll tackle on Wednesday. Just a few verses, but again, some really deep ideas as we finish up chapter 2. A really verse you're probably familiar with. I'm crucified with Christ. Nevertheless, I live. Not I, but Christ lives in me. In the life that I live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. We know perhaps that verse is a great song, but what is that? How does the whole context of Galatians help us put more meaning behind that verse? We'll talk about that on Wednesday. Thanks for your thoughts.